Greetings to all our friends who are currently attending this discussion on YouTube and those who will watch or attend later. My name is Mwelela Cele. I am a researcher at Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. On behalf of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, I greet you and welcome you to the launch of our working document titled The Crisis in South Africa's Energy Sector Towards a Just Transition, written by Brian Kamanzi. Briefly about Tricontinental. Tricontinental Institute for Social Research is an international movement-driven institution focused on stimulating intellectual debate that serves people's aspirations. Our agenda is set in consultation with political and social movements, and our research is conducted to promote social and economic transformation. Tricontinental has offices based in 4 countries, namely South Africa, Argentina, India, and Brazil. As I greet you all, I also extend greetings and a warm welcome to our facilitator and presenters. Today's launch and discussion will be facilitated by Jonis Ghedi Alasow. Jonis is the director of Pan Africa Today, an organization committed to strengthening and unifying the anti-capitalist and anti-imperialist struggle, the anti-imperialist struggles of Africa's movements and organizations through popular education, dialogue, and solidarity. He holds a master's degree in sociology and has done extensive research on popular politics in rural South Africa. The main presenter, Brian Kamanzi, is the author of the aforementioned working document. Brian is a renewable energy engineer and an independent researcher into climate and energy policy. He regularly contributes to public debate through the frequent publication of significant articles on local and international media platforms, including New Frame, Mail and Guardian, the Daily Maverick, and Al Jazeera, and was a participant in the 2015-2016 student worker uprising. He is passionate about contributing to broader and deeper struggles for political, social, and economic equality, and for the equity embracing legacies of Pan Africanism and progressive internationalism. The discussant is Phakamile Hlubi-Majola, the national spokesperson of the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa, NUMSA. Phakamile Hlubi-Majola is chairperson of the board of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research in South Africa. She was also involved in students' movements while she was at Wits University. Having come from within the media industry in South Africa, she has worked for Radio Today, Kaya FM, Radio 702, and ENCA. As I close, I just want to mention that copies of the Energy Crisis Working Document are available at the Commune Bookshop here in Braamfontein, and also on the website of the offices of Tricontinental South Africa. We are very much looking forward to this discussion. Once again, sincere thanks to you all. I just want to show you, this is the working document that we are launching. Thank you very much. I'm handing over to my comrade, Jonis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Comrade Mwelela. And again, thank you to all those who have tuned in both now and later. My name is Jonis. I'm very excited about today's discussion. I know that many of us, especially those based in South Africa, but unfortunately in many parts of the continent, are aware that we are confronted with an energy crisis. And I think it is a good opportunity today to think about where are we coming from, and importantly, what is the way out of the crisis that we are in. So I'm very grateful not only for my fellow panelists today, but also for all those who are joining in. And I want to encourage you to participate, even though sadly COVID-19 has meant that we have to shift this conversation to a virtual platform. Please feel free to raise questions, comments, ideas. The way forward is a collective way forward for all of us, and your inputs and your engagements are going to be very important. So today we are going to allow Comrade Brian to share with us a bit of an input based on the work that he has done. As you know, he was intimately involved in producing the working document. We will give him about 20 to 25 minutes to do that, at which point we will pause and allow Comrade Phakamile to pick out some comments, some questions, some engagements with his presentation. But as soon as the two of them conclude, we will also be sharing with them any questions that have been brought by the virtual floor that we have today. So thank you very much for joining. We are very excited about this very important conversation that we know has to happen not only today, but it's an ongoing conversation in multiple places. So at this point and on that note, I want to hand over to Brian to share with us his input. Thank you very much. Brian, over to you.
Thank you. Just to confirm, can everybody hear me and see me? Fantastic. It's really a privilege to be here discussing with you comrades. Especially Pakamila, I've been interviewing her on community radio for quite some time on these issues and often sending her messages about what's happening in the sector. So I appreciate the opportunity to speak back to some of what I've been hearing. And I've also, my personal journey has been influenced by a lot of comrades, particularly within NUMSA, but in other sectors of the trade union movements and civil society. Need to mention Comrade Miriam De Paula, who was in Tricon, who helped bring me into this project, actually. My comrades Simon Raquet and Tabang Bili, who also helped put this together and do some of the groundwork that got this going. Really, this document, a lot has changed since in the South African energy landscape since this document was finalized. And I think hopefully towards the end of this discussion can get into some of that. And I think that some of the, particularly the closing remarks in the document, which I'll leave you to read, stand the test of some of the developments that have shown up. We've seen increasing privatization in the space. We are about to see rapidly rising costs of electricity and expanded load shedding. All of that said, the purpose of this working document is to intervene on the debate. There's so much written. If you Google just transition in South Africa, there's so much written from every section of the ideological spectrum. The purpose was to intervene in this debate and say, actually, this is not a crisis of Eskom. It's somewhat mischievously titled in that sense, because the argument is that this is part of a deeper structural crisis. And that the reforms that were implemented in the post-apartheid period up to date have been unable to adequately address and redress the impacts of centuries worth of colonialism, dispossession, exploitation, and extraction, which is central to the legacy of Eskom and central to the legacy of energy. I think that there's a tendency or a feeling that either because you don't have access to electricity now because you live in an area that does not have grid access, or that you regularly are experiencing more and more load shedding, that there's something so particularly wrong with what's happening in Eskom that is the root of all of your problems. Comrades, I disagree with that. I think there's something deeper happening in this country that relates to, it's important for us to look at the longer arc of time. I won't be able to go through everything that was discussed in the platform, but in the booklet. However, I do want to spend a bit of time in the earlier parts of the history, because I think that's some of the least discussed on this topic. And in the question and answer, we can hopefully get to some of the more recent things if there's an appetite for that. So I want to start by a couple of points. The first one is there is a real pressure at the moment to talk about the unbundling of Eskom. And when people say unbundling, they mean the separation of generation, distribution, and transmission divisions within Eskom into, essentially it's a de facto or de jure privatization of Eskom. Right? They might still be publicly owned as generation, transmission, and distribution. However, globally, that type of policy is used to increase private participation and foreign direct investment in the energy space, particularly with generation. Right? It just so happens in South Africa that is with renewable energy. But as we are seeing in our context, that applies to coal. There are coal IPPs. People don't want to talk about that. There are now 2 new gas IPPs that have been, well, there are a few gas IPPs that have been listed as well. So this really, we're talking about the liberalization of the sector, right? And part of the argument is that the liberalization of the sector is unable to yield positive social outcomes, right? Let alone what this contested term of just transition. It not only will it fail the bar of just transition, but it will actually liberalization of the energy sector will make things substantively worse. So, that's the contention. So if we were to start, we can't start at the beginning, but this story, to some extent, begins with the intervention history of European colonialism in the mid-17th century. So with the founding of the Cape Colony, which was established through conquest and wars of dispossession, Dutch settlers expanded throughout Southern Africa through what we now come to know as South Africa, systematically dispossessing. It's important that I re-emphasize the point of dispossession, and we'll get to why that's central for so many aspects of the generation process. But by the time gold is discovered in South Africa in 1884 in the Witwatersrand, we are talking about, this is long before the establishment of Eskom. There is a situation where the Dutch settlers have established a various political structures in the Western Cape, Northern Cape, and have moved throughout the country. The British Empire has intervened in Southern Africa and is very excited by the discovery of particularly gold, but other precious metals and coal. There suddenly becomes mobilized an immense amount of capital from Europe, right? And there's a particular interest in gold. And so you have the entry of persons like, in South Africa is a very infamous guy at the moment, Cecil John Rhodes. You have the entry of these big capitalists in Europe seeking new markets in Africa and using South Africa as a site of entry, as a gateway, so to speak. So the tension between the Dutch settlers and the British precipitates in what's known as the AngloBull Wall, or historians describe it as the AngloBull Wall, which quickly results in the British conquest over the territory, which gives them access to the immense gold reserves in the Rand. So they require a few things to get this going. They require a labor regime in order to, the British, unlike the Dutch, do not have large emissaries on site to dig and to retrieve the gold. They need a labor regime, and then they need a method of transportation to get the raw materials from the site of extraction to its desired location. So railway and labor. They are able to manipulate and to coerce African communities, indentured groups from South Asia that were brought over during this period as well, to supplement the required labor component in mines by essentially establishing a capitalist economy in Southern Africa. So it's also important to make that point that capitalism arrives in Southern Africa as an intervening force. It interrupted history. It interrupted the local developments and the ways in which people were living. The late great Bernard Makubane described the migrant labor system as a transformation which gave a new complexion to almost every feature of South African life. So we cannot talk about South Africa without talking about the impact of the migrant labor system. Even though mining to some extent has reduced, the quotient of mining activities today has reduced. However, much of that sentiment still maintains, and very much remains to be a key part of our economy. There's a key text which we'll take every opportunity to invite comrades to engage with by Renfrew Christie, called Electricity, Industry and Class in South Africa, which spans the period from beginning of electricity to the end of apartheid, I would say the early democratic period. And in this telling of the story, electricity arrives in the Cape from wealthy households and early industrialists who are using electricity mainly for public lighting. People who like information for quizzes might know that Kimberley had widespread public lighting before the City of London. And part of the reason why they opted to go with electrical lighting for railways and for wealthy streets, Adderley Street was also one of the first streets in the world to be electrified, was that there was not an abundance of gas for lighting. So massive amounts of wealth extracted from the mines, They're able to afford expensive new technologies. They don't have gas like in other areas, and so they opt to use electricity. Right? So it's important, I think, to mention as part of the method is to identify at every time here that there is a purpose behind why electricity is used and produced, right? And so if we want to, jumping ahead a bit, if we want to have a different kind of society organized by different kind of values, it will transform the way in which we attempt to accrue and generate electricity, right? Over and above the means of utilizing. So other uses, early uses of electricity were for pumping of water for agricultural and in commercial farms and small-scale farms. Especially over long distances and over heights, up hills, for example, that's still used today, and to a limited extent in mining and manufacturing in electrical machines. So there were some rapid advancements starting to happen at the end of that century that was advancing electrical machines. But electrical machines were really used at this stage to improve mining efficacy in the face of labor shortages. So a key point that Renfrew Christie is making here is that we cannot think about, there is often, to put it crudely, when people think about industrialization in Africa, right-wingers often attribute the presence of a highly industrialized society or the existence of Eskom to the fact that there is a sedentary white population in South Africa. And it's a dark continent. There are more white people in South Africa. There's more power. There's more technology in South Africa. In fact, if we chart the history of how Eskom developed, really the turn towards machines was more in a response to shortages in, not about innovation and technology, but shortages in labor. And an attempt to fulfill a massive greed to multiply to compensate for labor shortages by multiplying the ability to extract, in this case, gold from the ground. That has nothing to do with the superiority of white, of white society and of white civilization. So it's a key point, in my opinion. So Cecil John Rhodes, who I mentioned earlier, was actually quite central to this whole story. He, through the British South African company, acquired concession rights for a proposal to establish a power plant at the Victoria Falls, a hydro plant at the foot of Victoria Falls, 190 megawatts, and had acquired concession rights along the way to put transmission lines between what was then Rhodesia and the Rand. So the idea was that they would be able to provide power from Victoria Falls to the Rand to power industrial machines that would help extract gold that would go to England, right? And through the rails, which connect from the Witwatersrand to Natal in particular. This project never came to fruition. It's very expensive. It was a very expensive thing to do at that time. It probably still is a very expensive thing to do, particularly with transmission lines. But what they were able to do was to use the finance capital that they had accrued by speculating on this project to establish what is called the Victoria Falls Power Company, right? That's a key institution in the early formation of the utility. I promise everybody this is very important. So why this is important is because the establishment of the Victoria Falls Power Company was the start of the first private monopoly in South Africa, right? So this entity essentially used its connections within government and used its availability of capital to dominate the early development of that sector, of the electrification sector. So there were also at that time competing sets of industrialists and I suppose in today's terms we would call them venture capitalists, who were acquiring rights for land. And land again is central because land is also tied to disposition. Acquiring rights for land to lay transmission cables. So people are seeing an opportunity. Okay, if we're going to be generating more electricity in the area, if I get land near the coal mine, then I can get the rights to have transmission lines over that land, which will benefit me in my bid to accumulate wealth. People with means are also accumulating the rights to coal mines, which would get them preferential treatment to supply the electricity companies, which are run by private monopolies, right? So at this stage, heavily dominated by the influence of British capital. So that is to say, we come from a history of it seems so far to where we are now, given that we have a massive state utility, but the electricity sector here is founded on the influence of foreign direct investment and private monopolies. I would argue that we are on the verge of coming full circle in the not too distant future. By the end of World War I, now by this time, Britain had benefited tremendously from gold mining in Southern Africa and would continue to do so. The economy was in recession, which led to discontent among the white working class and the black working class alike, and led to labor shortages. People were less willing to work in mines for a particular wage, which then ushered a period of mechanization, which results in job shedding. So these things are all connected, of course, because when we talk about who is unemployed in South Africa and why, it's often in pathological terms, and who's able to pay for services and so on. If we have time, we'll get to that. It's described in pathological terms. But really here, we see that the advances in technology were because of the ownership regime and because what they're feeding to were used to benefit those who owned the productive forces. They, through the development of electrical machines, were able to yield higher profits. And then those who were not willing to work for low wages were simply fired and retrenched and sent home, in this case, sent home to rural areas not yet Bantustans, forced to participate in an economy not of their own making. Yeah. So with the formation of the Union of South Africa in 1910, the local state that was emerging was beginning to seek more control over the economy. So now there's a political compact here between local British elites and Afrikaner elites, right? It's also important for us to understand these groups as being stratified by class and by interest. So in the energy sector in 1910, a Power Act was implemented, which concretized the relationship of the state and these private power producers. And this, at the same time, the state was also reviewing instances of expropriation. And this is a key point for me to raise publicly in this forum, is that as early as 1910, the state was looking at examples from the United Kingdom and the United States of private expropriation of private power utilities, right? This makes sense because a state that's essentially fairly weak, trying to establish itself, is having to contend with the raw force of a natural monopoly. There's a very high barrier to entering the electrical market because of how much capital it costs to put up infrastructure. So once you're in it, you've got a very unfair advantage. So states across the world, capitalist states, were conceiving of expropriation, right, for large private utilities. So upon hearing of the threat of expropriation, British capital was threatening now to withdraw their investments. Sounds familiar, I'm sure, to many of us across the global south. But of course, for a totally different set of circumstances. So this comes in tow with tensions that are brewing between Afrikaner elite and British elite at this time. A tension that ferments steadily over this period, right? If we fast forward to 1922, there's a key strike worth mentioning, the Rand strike of 1922, which was clamped down by the military. That they had dropped bombs. There's so much literature about and stories about the Rand strike of 1922. The impact of that strike on the electricity sector is essentially that the white working class was integrated into white-collar jobs. The settlement that was offered, at this time in mines, you have a diversity of people. You have people from the endangered stock working. You have African-descended workers there. You have white workers there. So in the aftermath of the 1922 strike, which is happening because there's broad discontent, white workers are absorbed and brought into the state. At that same time, an Electricity Act is passed by Jan Smuts' government, which initiates Eskom, the electrical supply company. So they create a state entity that they integrate enough of the white working class to quell the discontent and for a period, right? At this time, municipal generation is the key site of production, very different to our current situation. And it was providing low-cost power to railways for the transportation of coal and raw materials out through Natal, like I mentioned. So at this time, we don't have a national grid. The tensions between English elites and Afrikaner elites led to the ultimate establishment of the National Party. The National Party, in my assessment, is a compact between the Afrikaner elite and the Afrikaner working class, and to some extent the ambivalence of English capital, and maybe the provided that they are still able to access what they need to access, allowed certain things to take place. Or allowed some of their control over the territory to be subsumed. So the National Party wins an election in 1945 and establishes what comes to be known as the apartheid regime. In just a year later, in the Rand, there was a strike led by the black working class that saw over 60,000 mine workers stand against deteriorating working conditions, particularly in relation to their white counterparts. So there's almost like there's a deviation here in histories of some of the same people who might have been working on mines together, right? Which continues today. That deviation in parts, life trajectories, and opportunity continues. The National Party, inspired by ideologies of German fascism, build a web of repressive instruments to quell the ongoing spirit of rebellion. It's soon after that election that the Victoria Falls Power Company is expropriated and consolidated, bringing together generation, transmission, and distribution under Eskom, the state-owned enterprise. So at this point, the question should be why? Okay, we understand electrical generation is a natural monopoly. The state wants more control, yes. But sorry, I live near a mosque, so the prayer call is here. So you just need to guide me if it's too loud. Is it okay? Okay, great.
It's okay.
All right. So the part of the industrial policy of the apartheid regime was driven by this idea that, of course, they have demands from the white working class that they must attend to as part of the trade-off for ascending to power, the Afrikaner elite. So they establish a web of state-owned enterprises, which essentially is staffed. The white-collar jobs are staffed by the white working class. I'm talking Eskom, I'm talking Sasol, Telkom, which are all fed by cheap inputs that are made of the backs of the migrant labor system, cheap black labor, right? That is persistently needed to be kept in check by repressive apparatus. Ultimately, it failed, which is why we're in part, which is why we're able to have this conversation openly today. But that period was ultimately defined by that. So waves of resistance continued leading up to the 1970s. Obviously, there's a lot to discuss in between there, but it's by the 1970s that the national grid was established. So prior to the 1970s, you have essentially parts of electrical infrastructure all over the country operating separately. It's important to think about what happens when that grid is connected, because what it enables for Eskom, because Eskom, at that point in time is operating as a state monopoly, is that they're able to leverage economies of scale, right? So that means instead of having to have generators next to where your manufacturing plants, next to your steel plant, I can now have a plant in Mpumalanga that powers a factory in Saldanha Bay and another part of the country, right? So it enables that type of state planning.
Sure. Brian, because I'm conscious of time, I want to propose that as you start wrapping up, maybe we shift to some of the continuities today with what you've described so far, and then come back to some of this when we get into the Q&A, if that's fine.
No problem. Okay. So, okay, I'll try to leave out some of the part between the 1980s and 1996, but simply to say, at the part where electricity was beginning to be used more for residential purposes, the idea of separate development was central, and different people had different access to services. Electricity was becoming more a factor of what was considered to live a decent life. And so part of why we have the disparities we have today in electricity are because of the intentional structures and strategies that were employed by the apartheid government off the backs of a longer arc of history, right? In 1996, as part of the early, so when we're talking the Reconstruction Development Program, the early interest in redistributive and redress policies, which was quickly quelled, resulted in national electrification projects, which is where most of rural electrification comes from. We were able to do this because Eskom had had access to local capital reserves, which was not shared across many other African states post-colonialism, right? So again, questions about why there's more electrification one versus the other is not about color of skin and innate ability, and is more about intentional planning, who has resources and how you're able to deploy them, right? South Africa then adopts what many describe as self-imposed structural adjustment program through GEAR, which institute, obviously these were all resisted, but you can read about that, not just from all the things that have been written about this period, but implements a wide-ranging set of reforms. First, the idea of the purpose of Eskom is transformed. It's thought of now as a corporatized entity. So it's not to say that Eskom was not a capitalist enterprise before, but it was connected into a regime where the low cost of power was required. First of all, most people didn't have access to power, but low power was required to produce manufactured goods. So post-democracy, we are now talking the electricity. There is an investment strike. So the sources of local capital are held in the white elite, who are scared of retribution, who are scared of redress, and are seeking more opportunities to make essentially quick money, shorter-term investments. And there's a lot of capital flight in this period, right? So the corporatization, the impact of corporatization in the energy sector undermines progressive interpretations of the Constitution, which expand the idea that basic service delivery is a right, right? So you have the messaging that is contradicting one another because of essentially a lack of power and because ownership is structured in a particular way. So the reason that people, if we follow and accept some of the historical arc, the reason why Soweto has a historical problem with paying its electricity bills is part and parcel of the production of Soweto as a community. The reason why such a high proportion of people in this area are unemployed, the inability and the lack of prospects, real tangible prospects to gain gainful employment in the future, but also the misinterpretation of a tariff system which essentially individualizes structural problems onto you, the consumer, right? So it's to say that you are personally responsible for the electricity you require to survive. And yet, the majority of people are the reason why so many, far beyond South Africa's borders, so much wealth has been able to be exported out of this territory. So essentially, you pay twice. It was said by Trevor and Guane, formerly with the Anti-Privatization Forum. You pay twice. You pay once through your labor and then again through the tariff. So this is what we see today. Just quickly to say, the implementation of private renewables then is about a further market reform in the sector, right? The idea, the point that IPPs or REAP is green is part of the unlocking process to dismantle Eskom, right? It is the promise of jobs, the promise of the reduction of emissions at the moment is cynically deployed. This is part of the argument, is cynically deployed to unlock and dismantle the possibility of state planning and of policies, reforms, radical reforms that are about redistribution and industrialization, and chart a path towards an accumulation strategy that is about rent seeking. The public backs these IPPs If Eskom isn't able to pay, it's backed off national treasury. We give them all kinds of incentives to establish themselves, right? But what do we get out of it? Investors solicit rent and very high returns of these IPPs. So I say, yes, I support interventions to mitigate climate change, but it's from the longer story of Eskom, it's clear that ownership is central. Not ownership just of renewables, ownership of land, the ability to control and determine one's future, you know? And in order to do that, we need movement, we need power. We can't just demand these things in isolation. So I'll leave it there for now, and then we can discuss and revisit as necessary.
Comrade Brian, thank you very much. I think we will all agree that that was a very rich summary, and I know it is difficult to summarize not only all that's in the text, but also all that has gotten us to the point where we are. But I would like to go out on a limb and say that that was a very good rundown of at least some of the key elements, and we'll get back to some of them. We started this talk with a conversation about saying that this question of just transition and justice has been at the center of what we are saying. And from what I can tell, it's not only the transition question, but what Brian has described up until now is a history of Eskom that is intimately intertwined with fundamental injustice. And I would argue that there are people such as the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa, whose spokesperson we have today, who have been at the forefront not only of arguments relating to what does a just transition look like, in other words, how do we move from where we are to where we want to be, but also about what are some of those fundamental injustices that have been so aptly described by Brian, that we need to deal with not one day, but immediately. So on this note, I want to hand over to Phakamile to perhaps share with us some engagements and reflections on the presentation, but perhaps also kick us off with some questions that will allow us to deal with not just the question of where are we and how did we get here, but also what are the elements of the future we are hoping to build.
Thank you so much, Jonis. I really appreciate that. And I appreciate this opportunity to have this discussion. I think it's really important that these types of discussions should be led and confined really within the spaces of where the working class is, because it's the working class that is affected ultimately by these decisions. And we are the ones that are in the best position to articulate whether the that have been proposed are the best solutions for us. And that's precisely what the just transition speaks about. I also want to really take this moment to appreciate Tricontinental and the progressive work that this organization does in putting a spotlight on research and creating space for us to engage on socialist solutions or solutions that are centered within the working class and with a working class agenda and focus. We don't have enough of that, certainly not in South Africa. And I want to appreciate, Brian, all the effort that you put into putting together this, this presentation and all of the research that went into it. I know, unfortunately, because of time, you weren't able to actually give us everything. But luckily for you, I did read your presentation more than once. So I actually had written quite a lot of notes, and I hope I'll have enough time to go through some of my own reflections on what you've written. I'm gonna try and follow, but I'll kind of be all over the place as well. So please forgive me on that. First and foremost, I just want to appreciate the analysis and the depth that you gave when you were giving a historical account of the South African economy, starting from the moment of Jan van Riebeck's arrival all the way to the point where we are today in post-apartheid South Africa, because I feel like your paper centers us very, very well in terms of the exploitative nature of the MEC, the Minerals Energy Capital, and how it came together to operate in South Africa for the benefit, of course, of the minority. And it's also important to point out that from the very beginning, when the South African government took the decision to establish Eskom. And I love that Brian brought in his research the fact that a decision was taken to expropriate energy. And how interestingly today, the whole concept of expropriation is very, very taboo in mainstream media and certainly in liberal circles. And yet the South African apartheid government did so to guarantee its own ends. And really, what your paper really does do, Brian, especially right at the beginning, is it very clearly demonstrates how the apartheid government was very intentional about the role that SOEs like Eskom would play, not just in the provision of cheap electricity, but particularly in affirming the white minority as the supreme structure, and that's the structure of the economy. And how the African working class was dispossessed of land and forced to sell their labor power very cheaply at the mines in order to support this unfair system. That and I'm quoting you here, where you talk about how the Smuts administration had the express interest of rapidly industrializing the union's economy through the provision of low-cost power and the development of steel and iron works. This coincided with the state manufacturing company ISCO locking the new economy into the mineral energy complex. And I suppose the question I want to ask is, if the apartheid government could take a decision where it very clearly from the outset is empowering the minority by setting up these state institutions, and from the beginning, the goal of these state institutions is a developmental goal, whether it's Eskom, ISCO, or any of them, and not profit-driven for the benefit of this minority, then why are we not demanding that the current South African government take exactly the same decision, but in the interest of the working class majority? Because how far have we really moved since apartheid? We are now the most unequal society in the world. And the only way that we can undo the legacy of apartheid is to intervene on things like energy. In South Africa, the majority of people still struggle to access energy. In fact, it's worse now because of how energy has been privatized and how the private sector has been allowed to play a role through the renewable energy independent power producers. And so surely we should have, and there's still an opportunity now for the government to undo the poor decisions it took when it accepted gear and swallowed gear, and actually make that conscious decision. I don't know if you want to comment on that, Brian, before I move on to the next point.
Sure. Yes, I mean, ultimately, I agree with you. I think expropriation should be put back on the table. And I also want to say that the point that I was trying to make as well in the paper about trying to leave it open and talk about IPPs in general is that it's about liberalization of the sector. So whether it's the way that financial institutions are trying to profit seek off the provision of these services, right? So it just so happens that it's renewables. I think renewables have a very strong part to play. In fact, that's part, I see that as part of being part of my life's work. But the way that it's being done is to essentially to solicit profit. It's the same. It's also the same for the capitalists who benefit from coal contracts to the state-owned coal plants. So in order for us to achieve what you're talking about, Pagamila, it implies that power is required. And here I mean power of movement, because the current government does not have the ability or clearly the intention to take the kind of steps that are needed to make such a deep transformation. So a simple question as why is it that when we talk about transforming Eskom, we never ask the question of who are the workers in Eskom? What do they want? How amenable are they to deep changes? And what do their answers to those questions mean about our future?
And thank you for raising that, because it actually brings me to my next point, because you talk a lot about the renewable energy independent power producers, and I'm glad that you raised deep questions about the role that they play. I want to sort of highlight the NUMSA 9th National Congress resolutions, where we outline our vision for what renewable energy should look like. We say that we want renewable energy where beneficiaries, we do not want renewable energy where beneficiaries are large foreign energy power and technology companies. We want SOEs to be aligned to a development agenda, especially job creation. They should play a role in transferring skills and ensure skills development. We also say that social ownership of renewable energy can guarantee greater security of supply. And I feel like you captured that perspective in the report. And in one of the things we also demand as NUMSA is that the national grid must remain under public ownership and must remain the backbone of energy provision. Renewable energy must be community owned, and benefit the community in its entirety. The fundamental failure with renewable energy in South Africa is that profit as a motive is at the bedrock of the strategy. And as long as profit is the motive, then what exactly is the difference between renewable energy and the coal sector who got us to where we are today, where we were dealing with climate change as a challenge? Once you allow the private sector to determine and to drive that space, then it violates the principles of just transition. And I want to go to that because you do talk about that in your paper, and actually unpack for you why, for example, our position on REIPPs is a very, very strong one. We've been very, very opposed to the system because we feel that when you read the just transition principles as articulated by the ILO, which are captured in the Paris Agreement, what South Africa is rolling out currently is the complete opposite. It's a violation. And in fact, we are disgusted by the fact that the government even has the audacity to use that term, because in a real sense, on the ground, that's not what's happening. So I'm just going to break down for you exactly what our experience has been. And you also touch on a little bit on that also. For example, one of the key areas that we have a real problem with when it comes to renewable energy IPPs is the impact on jobs and job losses. The fact that for the renewable space to come into being means that several power stations have to close down in Mpumalanga, which according to a Bloomberg article would result in 120,000 jobs lost along the value chain. And yet there's no social plan, there's no alternative program that government has put in place to support workers as they transition, is really for us a major disgrace. The just transition principles are very, very clear that as you transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy, the next generation must be better off as a result of taking that decision. Now, if that means that 120,000 people are going to be left jobless, and yet there's no plan to absorb them into the economy, there's no plan to redefine what the Mpumalanga economy is based on, because at the moment, 40% of that economy depends on those coal-fired power plants, then it's going to be a complete failure. Why should there be a choice between protecting the environment and protecting jobs? And we believe, and the just transition very perfectly gives a baseline of how you marry the two without compromising any party. If you look at, for example, that since REIPPs came online, only 31,207 jobs have been created. And yet we were promised 114,000 job years by Jeff Hadebe. It tells you also a fundamental flaw in this policy, because it's not speaking directly to the challenges facing the majority of people. One of the things that was noted by NERSA was that 165,000 more jobs could have been created in the renewable energy space if they did not import most of the components used in the solar PVC field and concentrated solar power technologies. So again, the sentiments by NERSA speak directly to our concerns, that when you allow capitalists to drive this program, they are going to find any manner of ways to circumvent what it should mean. They're all about profiteering and cutting costs. And obviously for them, importing these PVCs is cost cutting, but look what it does in terms of job creation in South Africa. The other problem that we have with IPPs is that they cost more than the nuclear deal. The nuclear deal was severely criticized for being costly and linked to, obviously, Jacob Zuma and allegations of corruption. But if we are going to reject nuclear on the grounds that 1 trillion is too much, then 1.4 trillion, which is the cost of renewable energy IPPs between bid windows 1 and 4 is way too much. And that amount of 1.4 trillion comes from their own court papers that the Energy Department submitted when we took them to court on these REIPPs. They said in the court papers it's going to cost the fiscus 1.4 trillion. And that for us is completely unacceptable. Currently, REIPPs cost ESCOM 22 billion, for example, for the 2019 financial year. They add to ESCOM's cost drivers. One of the other cost drivers at ESCOM is coal, where the cost of primary energy coal is between 14 and 20%. So, you know, I find it important to say this because we are currently in the process of negotiating. We're about to open wage talks with ESCOM. And one of the big things that has been highlighted a lot in the media is how the wage bill is collapsing ESCOM. But the truth of it is that ESCOM is not being collapsed by workers and workers' wages. It's being collapsed by these corrupt arrangements of capital between the governing party and those capitalists who are making money off ESCOM, namely now the REIPPs and the coal sector. So until we deal with that fundamental problem, we will continue to have challenges at ESCOM. I had so many notes. I wish I had more than 10 minutes, Chair. But let me try and touch on a lot of the things that Brian mentioned in his presentation. I was also very interested in the solutions that you gave when you spoke about what is to be done. You gave a whole number of possible solutions. And I think a lot of the proposals that you put there are some of the things that even us as NUMSA, we could align ourselves with. One of the things I want to sort of raise with you, you talk about the bailing out of ESCOM with pension funds. I know this is something that COSATU proposed, for example, as a way of dealing with its debts. But one of the things that we have raised, certainly the DGS of NUMSA, Comrade Carl, has raised the fact that, you know, whilst we can have a debate about whether workers' pensions should be used to bail out ESCOM, at the same time, we can't have that debate without defining this question of ownership. So you can't take money from pension funds from workers, but not give them control of the entity. And one of our core demands consistently in relation to state-owned entities has been that workers themselves need to be represented on the boards so that we can start to deal with these corrupt contracts and corrupt relationships with corporations and capitals, which exist not just at ESCOM, but exist at SAA and SA Express and other state-owned entities and Petro SA even. So until we deal with that, we're not going to make much progress. Also, you talk about reevaluating the fairness of domestic lifeline tariff determinations. And you highlight the fact that, for example, in the Western Cape, it's the working class who are paying higher rates than affluent suburbs. And those are some of the things that many people are not aware of. There is always this assumption that the working class is parasitic and is leeching from ESCOM. Look at the debt of Soweto. But can we also focus ourselves on the parasitic nature of capital and what it has done to destroy ESCOM and bring it to its knees today? And there's certainly not enough focus on that. There is, because of the fact that the capitalists are in charge and are driving this machine, there is a heavy focus on breaking ESCOM apart. There is a heavy focus on allowing the private sector to participate. And all of those decisions will result in higher tariffs for the consumer. They will mean that electricity, which is already costly for many members of the working class and the poor, will just escalate because you're now pandering to the profit motive of the capitalists. And so this crisis of inequality, and certainly the inequality of access to energy, is going to be deepened and perpetuated. What we need is a socialist solution to the energy crisis, because energy is a public good. It is we can even say it is a human right, because it is not something that should be commodified, just like water should not be commodified. Why are we paying for solar energy? Are we paying for the sun? Why should that have a profit motive? So for us, it is really crucial that if we're going to talk about creating access to the working class, then everything must change. The economy of South Africa must be transformed for the benefit of the working class majority. All of these SOEs that exist we must promote a developmental agenda, a non-profit agenda, and the working class must be represented in those boards. Those are some of the things that must form part of the solutions for us. The one thing I do want to sort of ask you about, and I'm hoping you can just explain to me why you said this. I just want to find that quote. I actually cut it for myself here, because I wanted to understand your thinking when you said this. You said, campaigns, organizations, and movements concerned with transforming society at a fundamental level must accept that an alternative energy system does not automatically imply a break with systems of domination and exploitation. On the contrary, a shift away from energy derived from fossil fuels could well be accompanied by job losses, an increase in private profits, and increasingly exploitative and precarious forms of labor. I'm not sure I agree with you on that, and I'd like you perhaps to explain what you mean, because to me, it sounds like what you're proposing there undermines fundamentally what just transition is about and what it represents and its values. The just transition is unapologetic about the fact that the working class must not suffer. It's unapologetic about the fact that this transition must be led by the working class to their benefit. And it is unapologetic about the fact that it must not result, it must be sustainable, that the sustainable development is possible. It's possible we don't have to have this battle between preserving the environment, creating and preserving jobs. So if you can just explain your angle on that. Thank you.
Sure, yes. Okay, sorry.
No. I think my proposal is, because we are starting to get some interaction on the live feed as well. So perhaps, Brian, you can share your responses, and when we come back from that, we can start picking up on some of the common themes that are coming up in the questions as well. So Brian, please go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, just to start off with the last one, just to clarify, I think what I meant, and I think why in going through the arc of the history, it was important for me to identify some of the different sources that were used, is to say that just because you use an alternative to fossil fuels doesn't make it progressive. That in fact, you can use an alternative that results in negative outcomes like job losses. So I happen to support, for example, renewables over nuclear. However, I think those are debates that should be had openly and whatnot and so forth. But really, some of the legacy of the projects in Southern Africa, particularly hydro, it's not to say that hydro is bad, but it's to say that the initiatives that hydro was attempting to power, who it was planned for, what it was intended to do, capitalists don't have a particular fetish for coal. They don't need coal to survive. They don't. I know some people now drink coal, charcoal as a drink. I've seen that on social media. They don't require charcoal. They don't require coal. What they require is the accumulation of capital, right? So we need to keep clear about what it is that we are saying, and not be caught, because ultimately the question, and I think in South Africa, a lot of the question has been about the IRP. What is the energy mix? Do we have more nuclear? Do we have more renewables? Part of the difficulty, I think, you're speaking from NUMSA's perspective, and some of what I've been reading about what you guys are saying, and you can confirm for me if I'm wrong. Part of the difficulty in engaging in that debate is about how decisions are derived and the fundamental assumptions underpinning the idea of the IRP or the idea of a capitalist economy, right? So if we want to challenge the fact that we have a capitalist economy, part of the debate is how do you get there? So it's also about organizing workers in the space. Over time, the truth about the just transition, because now from what I've seen in ESCOM documents, the REAP process has been, if you see, they have a roadmap to just transition. So according to ESCOM, REAP is just transition, as far as what I can see. Even though before it was just REAP, they were challenged on just transition, so now they've relabeled it. But civil society has its own understanding of just transition. There's different civil society groups. Unions amongst them have their own ideas of just transition. So now there's a battle of ideas there, right? Who gets to ultimately make that decision? In order of, unfortunately, as it stands, the working class is not advocating from a position of strength. And so it requires the coming together of social forces. It requires organization. The truth of what's happening in renewables will partly come, and I understand some of that work is being done, by organizing workers in that sector. Where there is local manufacturing, organizing those workers. Where there are plants, solar and wind farms, we want to hear from those workers. What is their experience? What are the prospects for socialization? Yeah. Where is the money going?
Thank you, Brian. I think that answers my questions, especially with regards to that issue. I have so much to say, but overall, I really, as I said, I appreciate your. I see myself frozen on the screen, and I don't know what's going on. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. So
we are hearing you.
Okay. No, that's great. So I think it's really important that we are having these discussions and we are unpicking for ourselves what that would look like. And on that point, going back to this issue of what does a socially owned, or what is a just transition process? What would that look like? A great example for me would be something like what Spain has done. Yes, of course, the example is not exactly the same as South Africa. They've got a smaller mining sector. But one of the things that they did was they negotiated with the unions. There's an agreement. They know that the coal mines are going to close. And they came to an agreement that obviously the shutdown of these mines would mean that jobs will be lost. So as the government, we will then reinvest 250 million euros in those areas. And so because the government was so transparent about its process and was very clear and negotiated with those who were directed, it was easy for the unions to then say, okay, no, we can support this because we can see that you've taken the necessary steps to cushion workers and their families as they transition. And that's exactly what we need in South Africa. We need that type of honest, open, transparent, genuine engagement where we are finding solutions that really are for the benefit of us. I think we've seen already, for example, how progressive the Chinese government has been in how it has utilized state-owned entities. Specifically, I mean, if you just look at how they responded to COVID, I mean, that was incredible. But beyond that, because of harnessing the power of the SOE, they have utilized that to transform that energy sector, and now they contribute about 40% of the renewable energy to the world. So I just feel like, those are some of the things we really need to promote in this space, where we are promoting solutions that are beneficial to the masses. And having said that, I want to thank you again, Brian, for your research and for actually putting that together so that we could have this discussion and unpack some of the solutions for us.
Great. Thank you to both of you. And based on the interaction and the questions we are starting to get, I think the sentiments, Phakamile, that you had at the end of thanking Brian, thanking Tricontinental, but also thanking both of yourselves for what has already been a rich conversation, I think is important to make. I want to maybe start throwing some extra questions in. And what I'm going to do is not actually direct them all at one person, because I think there is a benefit of developing a way forward and answers in dialogue. So I think there's broadly 3 questions. I'm going to pitch 2 to Phakamile and 1 to Brian, to then, of course, we can all discuss. So Phakamile, question number 1 is, just transition is a concept that gets thrown around a lot, but very rarely defined in very clear, concise terms for everyone to understand. So question number 1 is, are you able to give us a layman's terms explanation of what do we mean when we say we want a just transition? That's question number 1. Question number 2, which I think I should just read out because it is phrased well, and I think Phakamile, just based on your involvement in the labor movement, is something that perhaps you can touch on, and then Brian can come in. And the question goes as follows: how can we build anti-capitalist working class movements in places which are directly affected by cutoffs, noting that the black working class is disproportionately affected? Because Brian, you kind of, I think, twice have come back to the point that the way forward depends on us building the power of those who are not in trying to have the bottom line be profit, and those who want the bottom line to be life and human beings. So the question of organizing, building that power is something that is at the center of what do we need to do and what is to be done. So I think, Phakamile, if you can start us off on that question of how do we build working class power in a context of an energy sector that so far has been governed by the principles of capitalism that don't have solutions for us, but a need for us to develop and find those solutions. So, and then the last question, Brian, which I'm going to point towards you again to start us off on, is the question of renewable energy is something that is, as we know, a very contentious one. And concretely, based on your research, what you've come across, and your assessment of the conjuncture that we are in, the question then is, there is this challenge of the kind of reliability of renewable energies, especially when the technology, the storage is not yet where it needs to be. So you have this conundrum. So the question then becomes, and you've touched on this, but perhaps you can come back to it, what is our way out of this challenge of reliability with renewable energy as a scientific question, independent of whether it's governed by the profit or the people margin? And what would the role of nuclear be, and if any, in our socialized ESCOM? So perhaps I'll hand over to Phakamile to kick us off, and then allow Brian to come back, and then we'll do a second round of questions.
Thank you, Jonis. Much appreciated. So let me answer the first question of the simple explanation of just transition. And I'm going to take it straight from the ILO's guidelines, the framework point 2, which says that a just transition, the needs of the present generation must be met without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Sustainable development has 3 dimensions: economic, social, and environmental, interrelated and of equal importance, and must be addressed together. And I feel like that point basically summarizes in full what that process is, what it must mean, and how it must be rolled out. At the end of the day, the masses, the most vulnerable, the working class and the poor, must be the ones to benefit. And if they don't benefit, then you failed. It's as simple as that. And on the question that you raise on how we can build working class movements and solidarity and campaigns, I think that's a very, very important question, because one of the challenges that we have, especially around the question of ESCOM, certainly in the way that it's been presented in the media, the media has focused very heavily on how ESCOM is a drain on the fiscus and how we basically just need to shed ourselves of it. It's a burden, let's get rid of it and move on. And private capital will fix everything, you know. The efficiency of the capitalist system will right all. And it is really crucial that we really do and intensify the messaging around that. Because as Brian very correctly said at the beginning of his presentation, the plans to break Eskom apart into 3 sections will not in any way resolve Eskom's core problems. Eskom's core problems are driven by its debt, and its debt is made up by the disastrous build program and the interest, pardon me, that's been generated by that. It's been made up by the very, very exorbitant coal costs and the REIPP costs as a result, in our view, of the corrupt relationship between the governing party and these capitalist service providers. And it's collapsing because of sales volumes, declining sales volumes. So when you say you're going to break Eskom up into 3 parts, how is the breaking up of Eskom into 3 parts resolving those major issues that I've just highlighted to you? First of all, what you're actually doing is increasing the cost, because all those 3 divisions of Eskom are going to need an executive teams, CEOs, CFOs. That's going to increase the cost, surely. And also, one of the things that government has proposed, and I love that Brian also mentions it as one of the things that must be tackled in the solutions, is the fact that municipalities have been allowed and have been told that they can procure directly from renewables without having to go through the grid, without having to go through Eskom. Now, that is a direct attack on Eskom's customer base. And when you do that, you are basically saying, and I think Brian does actually make this argument at some point in his research, that what's going to happen is that the middle class and those who can afford will then start to reap the benefits of renewables that they can afford, but it will be the working class and the poor that now have to fund Eskom. And mind you, we already know that they're struggling. It's very expensive, and they can't afford to do that in a sustainable way. So it forces us to then analyze what are the true motives that this government has in restructuring Eskom. Is it restructuring Eskom for the benefit of society and so that we have a better run Eskom, or is it a more insidious agenda? And for us, it's definitely a more insidious agenda.
Camila, we are not getting you as clearly.
Who is the...
There we go.
Oh my God.
We lost
Can you
just as you were explaining the insidious agenda.
Okay, let me shorten my insidious agenda because I think I'm taking way too much time anyway. But the point I'm making is that the agenda is not about us. The agenda is not about the public, and it's certainly not about the working class. The agenda is to enrich a minority elite at our expense. And this is why we have to really do much more to concretize and solidify struggles between ourselves and working class formations on the ground fighting for energy access. It is very important that unions like NUMSA work together with the likes of Soweto Action Committee, work together with all other grassroots formations that are fighting for access to energy. One of the things we've been severely criticized for, especially in wage talks, is our refusal to support Eskom's demands for an increase. Every time these applications are made, we go to NERSA and we oppose it. And we oppose it knowing that people will say, when we come to wage talks, they'll say, but you guys didn't fight for an increase, and now you're coming demanding salary increases. No, it's because we have to think beyond our own narrow agenda as a trade union and think broadly about society. Would society benefit from higher electricity tariffs? No. So it is very important that the trade unions must take a progressive and play a progressive role in ensuring that the demands that they make for the changes that must happen at the highest levels at Eskom speak to them of a society as a whole and are not just about improving the conditions of our own workers who happen to be members.
Yes, thank you. I'll start first by the question that wasn't directed at me about how do we. And my only addition to that really is that coming up, there are 2 sets of price increases coming. The first one is for a court case that Eskom lost against NERSA. I think it's 6.6 billion rand that they've been allowed to recover over a 2-year period through price increases for wrongful tariff determinations from 2014 to 17. So there's a price increase coming for that. Another price increase, if Eskom is allowed, there's a proposal that's been put forward to restructure the tariff so it won't be domestic and residential, as was at the time of the writing of this document. And it will be cost-reflective tariff and time-of-use tariff. And there's a whole conversation we can have with that. But the ideology behind the cost-reflective tariff is that you as the individual should pay for the price that it costs to get that electricity from the generator to you. Now, obviously, if you buy into at least some of what's been discussed today, that is flawed, because if you are in a place where it's more expensive or for you to have access to electricity, why you are where you are is determined by things beyond your control, beyond things that because of things that we are currently fighting. And so the people who will stand to benefit from this, of course, are the wealthy and sections of the middle class. The working class will essentially be penalized by the idea of cost-reflective tariff, because they both pay for the services, the basic services needed to live, through employment or through unemployment. By being unemployed, you essentially, the cost of labor is dropping, which helps the capitalist earn more profit. So either way, you are screwed, But if you remove the idea, or if you whittle away the idea of cross-subsidization under this social democratic paradigm, if you erode that, then you will lead to an outcome where the middle class and the wealthy will benefit at the expense of everyone else. It's that simple. So if those two processes unfold in the next year or so, that means that there's going to be a social base. And if there's the decommissioning of plants, we've also seen that there's a lot of private renewables that have been called out for by the government. If those things take place, then it implies that there are potentially workers in coal-affected communities and in power plants that are potentially decommissioned, either through, that they're too old, or that they're decommissioned early because we want to move away from that, or because you simply can't afford basic services anymore and you are being forced to the streets. So there's two groups of people that are going to be, more than is currently the case, activated into responding. And history is our guide, is that these groups, these communities across South Africa will strike. So it presents an opportunity for organizations to leverage that momentum to have some kind of shift, right? So the question about if, the purely scientific, whatever, that's a longer conversation that I don't feel totally qualified to give an answer that would be satisfactory to you. I would say two things, though, is that I think that it's more about the process. We need to find a process of coming to decisions that can help us arrive at the question of how we can solve the reliability problem of renewables. So what do I mean by that? When the case of China was mentioned, actually China benefited the Chinese renewable energy industry had a lot of foreign direct investment, but the government was able to constrain. But obviously, there's a whole lot of factors about China that are not necessarily totally comparable to South Africa, but they were able to constrain and tame and control capital to their will, essentially. And they were able to build a local industrial base by limiting the return of capital on investments in China. So there's a lesson there that the state can be used to yield progressive outcomes. So if we know that, if we can see that that's possible, even if we don't want to have the same outcomes as China, if we can see that that's possible, then that means that that's a door open for us in our context to change and transform our environment. I believe that there are people, particularly within Eskom, who can answer your question, who work in grid planning, who have first-hand experience with managing the stability and reliability of the South African grid, and can say, oh, you know what? Actually, what if we had more hydro? What if we invested over a 30-year period on green hydrogen. It's too expensive now, but maybe one day, if we put money aside and hope that it pays off, we can make that decision from a place of confidence and of saying that we are putting our risk in our own future, and we are not taking risk and also making sure that in that risk for providing a better future for ourselves and our children, we're also making sure that some already very rich people make a good enough profit of our risk on our future. We don't have to do both things. So, but simply to say, I think that the interest of private renewable utilities on gas is instructive. They recognize that there's a challenge of reliability, and having access to gas can solve that for them. We don't want to use gas if you believe in reducing carbon emissions, but there are things emerging like green hydrogen, which are too expensive. They are too expensive, but because it's expensive today doesn't mean it will be expensive tomorrow. The question is more, how can we build the type of economy where when we take risks, we're taking risks for our benefit, not to ensure the profit seeking of other individuals, right? There is no solution to the just transition problem, because you can't solve the just transition thing and have the rest of the South African economy the way that it is.
Thank you to both of you. I am very saddened to be the guy whose job it is to look at the clock, because I think we could have continued much longer. I want to, and I know we only have a few minutes left. We're not necessarily going to get to touch on every question that has come, but I think there's two that I want to throw out for very quick responses, if possible, before we try wrap up. One relates to a call to say that, is it not necessary for us to revive an anti-privatization movement? And perhaps not unrelated to that, to say that, and not unrelated to the question about how do we organize ourselves, is to what extent, if any, and I think this is a Phakamile question, is the principle of a just transition an aspect of the negotiations that we are having that are coming up with Eskom, but all interactions, I suppose, with Eskom, both in the formal and informal negotiations. The other question that I think has to be thrown in for a few seconds here is that, I mean, we've mentioned China. One important statistic about China is that it has lifted 600 million people out of poverty this year. 600 million people, the same number across the African continent today, are sitting without electricity. So the question that we've been debating up until now is not limited to a question of South Africa. So I suppose, to try and paraphrase what we are asking, there's load shedding in Zambia, there's crises in Ghana, there is, Brian mentioned a historical point, the Victoria Falls are not within the 1884 borders that have been drawn in Berlin. So what is the Pan-African aspect to the debate we are having here around the question that is confronting us of finding a socialist answer to this energy question? So if I can give each of you maybe 2 minutes to wrap up your final thoughts and ideally touch on these questions, then we can pick up from there. So perhaps we can let Brian go first this time, and then Phakamile, and then we can try and summarize.
Time for something like an anti-privatization forum, I guess. Many of the people who are involved are still around and still active. So it might be also time for folks who are directly involved to speak up. I'm sure there's lots of lessons to be learned, so the same mistakes are not reproduced where there were mistakes. On your point, I think again it's about when we look at how capital is moving in relation to the energy questions that we're discussing today in Africa, it does not really limit itself to borders. In fact, something that I wish I had achieved better in the booklet is the point that Eskom itself has been a regional entity, and it remains to this day to be a regional entity. Eskom is one of those legacies of the past that raises interesting questions about the colonial project as a whole. Because Eskom is the provision of power to Southern Africa is tied to resource extraction which is tied to the rest of the world. So it defies the idea of national borders already. So capital is not interested in whether it's South Africa. There might be policy specific levers that help it enact its agenda of accumulation, right? But at the moment, it operates and moves very much in a globalized fashion. It's very agile. It's able to deploy investments across contexts. And in the power sector, some of the legacies of neoliberal reforms are these ideas of power pools. It's kind of it's not necessarily a regressive idea, but is often governed by policies that support private power participation. Like there's something called the South African Power Pool, and there's different power pools for different regions. So the different grids are connected to one another, and they increase stability. There's a limited amount of trading that takes place of energy. In Europe, there's a fully fledged energy trading market, and energy is bought and sold through a market, through market interactions. So the more that this takes place in Africa, the more it's going to be relevant for workers in the energy sector to be discussing about their concerns, about the ways in which capital is behaving as yielding negative outcomes, come together and start forming that solution. First, through building stable relationships, through having analyses that are concrete and that are based on facts and are based on what they see, because they work on the ground. They know exactly that if we trip a plant in southern Botswana, another area is going to be out. They can tell you, So to have those kinds of conversations, to facilitate for organizations like this and other, trade unions themselves, to finance and ensure that where struggle is taking place, that those lessons are connecting with other strategic areas. That if Eskom is participating in Angola, which it is, are we discussing with energy workers in Angola about what they want? And does that align with what we want? And if not, where are the points of difference? Does it enhance our understanding of the world? Is there a program that emerges from there that we can take forward? So it's about the method of solving problems. That is the question, as opposed to the solution of like the Pan-African energy thing is to have solar farms everywhere or wind farms everywhere. We need to find a reliable way of solving problems that yields tangible results. And we can only do that by coming together.
Thank you. Pagamile, 2 minutes, please.
Can I say I'm covered? Pardon me. No, I think Brian captured it so well when he talked about the kind of cooperation that is necessary at a regional and Pan-African sort of continental level in terms of how we deal with this. Because even when we're talking about even the solidarity campaigns, for example, as you've correctly pointed out, Jonis, we actually have a lot in common with our neighbors in terms of access to energy. We're actually facing the same problem. It's the working class that don't have access to affordable, reliable energy all over this continent. So the question then becomes, how do we solve this? And if we were to come together more concretely about tackling this problem from that perspective, we could probably come up with the right kind of solutions. Obviously, Eskom has a long history of being a player in the region, and it does have solutions for the energy crisis that is faced by many countries. But the relationship that Eskom and that the South African government has had with these countries has been one of from a very colonial perspective. So it can't obviously be us repeating that same type of relationship. It would really have to be a completely different relationship on different terms and based on solutions advanced by the masses. And I think that's where our challenge is going to be. But just because it's a challenge doesn't mean it can't be done. And there's certainly an argument to be made that this is part of the work that we have to be doing as part of the solidarity campaign, is reaching across borders and talking about our shared experiences and our shared challenges and coming up with solutions that are beneficial for us. So that's on the question of the regional role that Eskom can play. and absolutely support the fact that we should resuscitate the anti-privatization campaign, because it's exactly what we're facing in South Africa today, where there is a very, very clear agenda by government to increase the participation of the private sector. We must learn lessons from other countries across the world. In the UK, for example, there are growing calls for those utilities which were before state-owned, which have now been privatized, to go back to being state-owned. I mean, as recently as 2019, The Guardian was reporting on a poll that was done that spoke about something like 77% of the population wants public ownership to return. So clearly, if the working class in other parts of the world are telling us that privatization is failing them, why are we pursuing this disastrous course of action? It clearly does not work, has not worked, and it does not at all answer the true problems that are facing Eskom, as I highlighted earlier. And then on the issue of the demands, and very interesting question that was raised around that, we have actually escalated the demands of the just transition in the demands that we're presenting to Eskom. We've said in the presentation that we've done to management, for example, that we want a just transition, and that a socially renewable energy sector is at the center of that. And we even go further to say that we also want to understand why Eskom has been taken out as a player in the renewable energy space. Why is it that government took a decision to only allow the private sector to drive that agenda, instead of following the example of China, where the Chinese government, through the Chinese state-owned energy company, drove renewables? We want an Eskom that's going to drive renewables, not an Eskom where the private renewable energy companies are parasites of Eskom, which is the current relationship that we have today. And these are some of the things that we've put in there, and we certainly hope for a positive outcome. But I think anybody who has been reading the papers and following what's been happening lately is very aware that the South African government is very determined to hand over our assets to private capital. And that is really our biggest challenge at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Phakamile and Brian. I know we have run out of time, but I think there is an urgency to ensure that this does not conclude this very important conversation. So I have two pleas that I want to make. Plea number one is the working document that was produced by Tricontinental, which we've been discussing here, is really an excellent document. And it's an excellent document that I want to encourage everyone who perhaps has not had a chance to have their questions answered to read, to engage. It's a wonderful historicization of the crisis we are in, and it gives us a platform to start thinking about the question we are confronted with, which is the question of where to from here. And on that note, which brings me to my second plea, is to say that this is not the only or the last conversation on this. Both the two panelists, but also those who have engaged us in the comments, but throughout the South African, African, and international community, who are concerned with finding ways of ensuring that the future that we are building is a future that is centering the question of life, the life of the planet and the life of its people. And this is something that has to be debated, and it's only through dialogue, like we have come to multiple times, that we are going to get to the elements of what is the people's answer to the crisis and to the question of energy that we are confronted by. So those are my two pleas as a matter of conclusion. I think it remains to give an extremely heartfelt thank you and round of applause to Brian and to Phakamile for an excellent presentation, excellent discussion, which we know started here but won't end here. And I think we share our thanks to all of you. I think we also have to thank Tricontinental Institute for Social Research for not only the wonderful work that they do in the day-to-day, but for this particular project, which is a pertinent intervention in the conjuncture that we find ourselves in. So thank you to Tricontinental. But lastly, and most importantly, thank you to all the people who took out some time to engage us, to watch this presentation, and who will continue to watch this, because ultimately it is not one or two people that are going to solve this question, but it's going to be a collective effort that all of us are a part of. And we are, I think today, and I am taking liberties, but I think we are recommitting ourselves to being part of that way forward that is just, that is people-centered, and that does not recognize profit as something that we should be prioritizing. So thank you again to everyone. Have a wonderful day, evening, wherever you find yourselves, and let's keep up the conversation and the engagement. Good night, and thank you very much to everyone.